and you all have the same stuff that was sent to you as part of the press release this morning, but this will be helpful for what we're doing today.
And then we'll probably move over here for any questions that you may. I really need to have you over there to push that. You can figure out where all this is.
Got it. Scott, did you grab the stuff?
Go over here.
Okay.
I'm going to sit here. We invite you to sit around the table, stand. You can tell it's a crowded conditions in here. That's just how it is. That's what we got.
Big as my house.
You need the one. Will.
Excuse me.
Hey, Todd. Somebody try to. Yeah, you're someone trying to open it up, or?
Yes, please. Open it. I am. Yeah.
Of course.
If you'd like, please take a seat at the table. It's offer you a good vantage point of this map and the whole scene as it unfolds.
You can see it right there. That's what can be. Feel like radial tire man. So we would have some of you to set the table, please.
Thanks. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Get good shots of that,
Sorry, what'd you say? What'd you say?
I just seen, did you get good shots?
Be able to change around later on. Are you guys ready? Yep.
All right. Well, I wanted to thank all of you for coming. Very important issue, and I appreciate your time and effort. And I'm here to describe for you a very complex case and how I arrived at the decision that I did. I want to start off with some ground rules. I understand that you'll have some questions, or I expect you'll have some questions. I would really ask that we hold those until the appropriate time, because I think we need to have an understanding of what happened and how I arrived at my decision, and then certainly willing to answer whatever questions you may have. The document portion of the investigative file has already been made public at about 9 o'clock this morning. That includes several thousand pages of material, and there are also photos and audio and video files that will be available upon request. We simply didn't have the technology and the bandwidth capability of putting those on the website, but we have made all of the written documents. We have made the appropriate written documents available on the website in the neighborhood of 5,000 pages. I think we'll get to a more specific number a little later. I believe that transparency is paramount. That's why we're sitting here the way that we are, because I'm going to have to try and explain to you what has gone on in the scene on November 1st of 2015. And we are also providing you some documents. We are providing you a copy of the declination letter that we sent to the Adams County Prosecuting Attorney. It goes through in some detail why we've arrived at the conclusion that we have. I would invite that for your reading. Do you have a copy of it?
I don't believe so, no.
Can we get some copies of that?
How many?
Let's just make sure everyone, do you have one that looks like this? It's a letter to Matthew Fox, the Adams County Prosecuting Attorney. We don't have any over here.
No declination letter?
Right. Let's make sure.
I'll get some. How many do we need? 1, 2, 3, 4? Okay.
So, then let me tell you that we will deliver to you a declination letter while you're sitting here, so that you have it. We also have what we are terming a fact sheet. And that fact sheet identifies not all of the facts, but some of the relevant facts that apply in this instance, and the fact that there's controversy and conflict among the various witnesses' statements that actually forms part of the issue in this case. So we also commend that to your reading. We have statements from the 4 primary witnesses that also identify some of those conflicts among their statements. Also have 2 other documents that we're going to talk about, the ethical requirements for prosecution, which outline the specific duties that we have and one of the specific statutes that applies in this instance. We'll talk about those in a few minutes. And finally, I consider this briefing to be on the record. And if we come to some point that we have something that we can't put on the record, we will stop and we'll talk about that and discuss the matter. But if you're willing to agree, we'll get this entire briefing on the record. So first of all, sort of outside my responsibility, my prosecutorial responsibility, I want to say that there were tragic events that unfolded in our state and in our community on November 1st of last year. There's no way to undo those tragic and tumultuous events. It has separated a community. It has caused untold grief. My condolences go out to Mrs. Yantis and to her family and to the council community, to Adams County. And we, as a state, are the losers in that a member of our community is dead, and we can't fix that. And I do hope that there will, in time, be some healing in the Adams County community and council, and that citizens will feel far more trust and confidence in their local public officials. And I look forward to that day, but right now I understand there's tremendous consternation. I also want to recognize the Idaho State Police. They did an extremely thorough job of this investigation. Their professionalism came shining through. They were determined, they were professional, they were objective. I cannot thank them enough. They did an extremely good job in their investigation. I also want to thank some of my own, who is the chief of our prosecution division, and Mike Steen, who is the chief investigator of our criminal division. And they and their teams put a lot of effort into this matter, and I certainly appreciate all of their effort. I want to touch briefly on the scope of my review, because I imagine that some of your questions are going to deal with issues that I didn't consider, and by statute was not responsible to consider. So the scope of review in which we engaged is very limited, very narrow. We focused on the facts, the evidence, the statements before and during the moments after the shooting, and that's it. Within those parameters, it was my duty to then determine whether these deputies, beyond a reasonable doubt, committed a crime. It's equally important to understand what this review did not consider. This includes matter of law enforcement policy and public policy and administrative matters that were beyond the scope of this review. Such things as the appropriateness of the firearms in possession of the deputies during the shooting, body cameras and their proper usage. You will notice in the information that there is no body camera video. This made our job far more difficult. But it was not appropriate for us to weigh in on the policy of whether they should or shouldn't have been operating. We're stuck with the fact that no body camera video exists. And as a consequence, we have to then make our decision without the basis of that information. We also didn't address the policy in the local community of calling ranchers to the scene when an animal has been injured. We did not consider any other civil policy or administrative matter. Our focus was very narrow and very limited to the issue of whether there was proof beyond a reasonable doubt that a crime was committed and that these officers committed it. Policy questions of those other kinds will be considered in other forums and be resolved in other forums. That is not the focus of what we did. So let's sort of get to the nuts and bolts of our decision. After reviewing the facts, the evidence, and witness statements and applying them to the relevant criminal statutes, I have concluded that no criminal charges will be filed against Deputies Brian Wood and Cody Rowland. And as such, this decision closes my role in this investigation. And the details and analysis are spelled out in the declination letter. Have we provided them that? She's making copies, and we'll get those to you. Press release package that went out earlier this morning, but I just want to make sure that you have that material. I hope that I can help you understand the complexity of this case, that if you take the time to read the materials, you will see that it legally and factually, this is a complicated matter. There are several other essential points that I want to discuss, because this case presented to us significant legal and ethical challenges as prosecutors. First of all, a prosecutor's duty his primary duty is to seek justice, not seek conviction. If you look at the ethical requirements for prosecution that I have, Idaho Rules of Professional Conduct Rule 3.8 provides that the prosecutor in a criminal case shall refrain from prosecuting a charge that the prosecutor knows is not supported by probable cause. The comments to that section also provide that a prosecutor has the responsibility of a minister of justice and not simply that of an advocate, and is to make certain that guilt is decided upon the basis of sufficient evidence. What that means is that we have the duty to make certain that we believe that there is evidence of proof of guilt to file criminal charges. That is also supported by the American Bar Association rule, which says that a prosecutor should not cause to be instituted, or permit the continued pendency of criminal charges in the absence of sufficient admissible evidence to support a conviction. So that's the standard by which we are making our judgment. And the fact that we have made the determination that there is not sufficient evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, we are ethically bound to not file criminal charges. In other words, we file criminal charges if and only if we believe we have evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. We also have to take into account the Idaho Code Section 18-4011, justifiable homicide. homicide by an officer. This is part of the homicide statute, and it provides that homicide is justifiable when committed by public officers, when reasonably necessary in the discharge of any other legal duty. Use of deadly force shall not be justified in overcoming actual resistance unless the officer has probable cause to believe that resistance poses a threat of death or serious physical injury to the officer or to other persons. We considered other criminal statutes in this matter, including murder, voluntary manslaughter, and involuntary manslaughter, but the facts did not measure up to the standards required by those statutes. The justifiable homicide by officer statute dictates that the ultimate question in this case will be whether the use of deadly force was reasonably necessary. That means the burden of proof is on us as the state, and we would be required to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the homicide was not justifiable. I want you to stop and think for a moment. Place yourself at your dinner table. You receive a telephone call that you have a bull that's out on a highway. You drive down to the end of your driveway. That's simply what you do. And 5 minutes later, you are dead, shot by officers. Something went tragically wrong in this event. That's not what the outcome should have been. But my job as a prosecutor is not to determine what went tragically wrong. My job as a prosecutor is to determine whether there's proof of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That is a different function. And in this instance, within this tragic and catastrophic event, we have made the determination that there is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. We are not saying that the officers were justified, nor are we saying that the officers were not justified. We are simply saying we do not have evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's simply what we are saying. As I stated earlier, this is a complex case, and piecing together exactly what happened during that 5-minute window when deputies called Mr. Yantis from his home to the time that the fatal shots were fired was challenged significantly due to the conflicting testimony that would be offered by the 4 primary witnesses to this event. Those conflicting statements create sufficient doubt to prevent a jury from holding anyone criminally liable for this unfortunate and tragic death. Our declination letter explores the varied versions in some detail. But I want to explain to you the overview of the scene and try and demonstrate for you some of the complexity of this case. So I'm going to move over here to this map. And this drawing was prepared by the Idaho State Police and demonstrates the crime scene, the investigative scene that we reviewed. And what happened was a bull belonging to Mr. Yantis got out of its normal pasture and was on Highway 95. This represents Highway 95 moving in a southerly direction here and north to that direction. The bull was struck by a car that occurred south of the Yantis driveway, north of the community of Council. The bull was injured, and the occupants of that car were also injured and had to be life flighted to the hospital. Officers responded to this scene. I think the call went out at 7:10 p.m. on November 1st, indicating that there was the bull was out and there was an event happening here. The officers arrived at the scene. It was Officer Cody Rowland and Officer Ryan Wood.
Excuse me a second. Can you come around with all this because it's kind of a distraction?
I'm sorry.
No, I apologize for that.
By the way, I've asked that my staff interrupt me and make certain that what I am telling you is accurate to the best of our ability. So if they interrupt me, that's what that is going for. It is a complicated case, and because of the fact there's so many different stories, so many different statements, I'll give you the basics, try and get some spots here, but this is not a static scene. This is very tumultuous and changes, and so I'm going to try and do the best I can for you. They're going to help me, but recognize that's the situation that we have. So, call went out 7:10, and Mr. Yantis was called at 7:22. The officers radioed at 7:27 that Mr. Yantis had compressed time frame, 5 minutes from the phone call until he has been shot by the officers. This is also a very confined space. We have been physically to this location. There is no other route around this. This is a very narrow part of Highway 95, recognizing that the initial accident occurred in this location. There was traffic that was to the north of this scene. The officers, as they arrived, allowed some of that traffic to move through the scene, and they were collected down here in the southern part of the scene. There were semi-trucks that were not allowed to go through because they were too big, and they could not turn around and go back up Highway 95. As the officers arrived, one of them arrived in a patrol vehicle, patrol truck of some sort, and parked that truck in the Yantis driveway. The Yantis property is up here and it kind of circles around in that direction. The bull was alive, injured, and in the vicinity of this scene. It began to be a problem for the emergency workers and others who were present. It presented a threat to them and needed to be dispatched. That's why the call went out to Mr. Yantis, but also as it became aggressive, Deputy Wood fired a number of shots and shot the bull. The bull's original position, as we come to the scene, is that it was lying next to this truck, which was a
White Dodge truck that it's believed that one of the first responders parked.
So this was not a patrol vehicle, it was a first responders vehicle. The bull was lying with his feet underneath it, up against the wheel well of this truck with its head facing to the north. The reason there's a second bull on this map is because ultimately the bull got up and moved and changed its position and came to rest in that approximate location. So again, this is a very volatile scene. So the officers had called Mr. Yantis. Mr. Yantis and his wife and his nephew, Rowdy Paradis, were at dinner. Mr. Yantis and his wife got on an ATV, a four-wheeler, drove from their house down the driveway. Mr. Paradis, who was the nephew of Mr. Yantis, drove a skid steer to the scene. That skid steer came for the purpose of providing illumination, light on the scene, and also to remove the carcass of the bull once it was dispatched.
Can I interrupt you real quickly?
Yes, please.
With regard to the statement that the officers called the family, it was not these two officers on the scene. The call at 7:22 was actually them calling dispatch, asking dispatch to call the owner of the livestock to come deal with it. So after that call, dispatch called the family. So there was no interaction between these officers and the family until they actually arrived on scene.
So I've asked corrections, clarifications.
Clarification.
They've got your back. Yeah, well, it's hard. I mean, this is a complicated scene. And so Mr. and Mrs. Yantis arrived. We can tell you that Officer Wood was in this vicinity of a small turnout sort of across, diagonally across from the Yantis driveway. And he fired a number of rounds into the bull from this location. Mr. and Mrs. Yantis arrived. Mr. Yantis exited the four-wheeler, retrieved his rifle, maneuvered the bolt mechanism. It was a bolt-operated .204 caliber rifle, and approached the bull and moved around to the north end, pointing his gun south at the bull. At that point, as nearly as we can tell, Mrs. Yantis was near the four-wheeler. Mr. Paradis was somewhere in the vicinity of the skid steer. Officer Wood was somewhere near the bull, but that is in dispute among the four primary witnesses. And Officer Rowland was somewhere in the southbound lane of 95. Again, that is a matter in dispute among the four witnesses. Mr. Yantis prepared to shoot the bull. The officers were concerned of the direction in which he was shooting, which was in the general direction of where the original accident scene was located. And as a consequence, and again, this is disputed among the four witnesses, that there was some sort of interaction between one of the officers and Mr. Yantis. From Mrs. Yantis said that originally it was Officer, she didn't name him, but she said that her description of him would have been Officer Wood, that Officer Wood had some kind of interaction with Mr. Yantis. She also, at a later time, indicated it was Officer Rowland who had the interaction with Mr. Yantis. Mr. Paradis indicated that it was Officer Rowland who had an interaction with Mr. Yantis. Officer Wood indicated that he had the interaction with Mr. Yantis, and Officer Rowland indicated that Mr. Wood had an interaction. The nature of that interaction is also in dispute among the various witnesses. Some of the witnesses have said that Mr. Yantis pushed Officer Wood. Others have said that Officer Wood grabbed Mr. Yantis either by the arm, or some others have said by the back. And so there's a great deal of confusion about what happened. Again, this is a very tight space, a very compacted time, and these witnesses have different vantage points. So there was this physical or perhaps not physical interaction that occurred, but some sort of confrontation between Officer Wood and between one of the officers and Mr. Yantis. By the way, I forgot one element. As Mr. Yantis exited the four-wheeler, he said, and this is a quote from him as nearly as we can tell, to one of the officers, "Get that piece of shit away from my bull," or something of that nature. Again, there's dispute as to what the exact words that were used. So, as Mr. Yantis prepared to shoot, there's the physical confrontation, and Mr. Yantis then moved somewhere into the middle of the roadway. As he did so, again, there is dispute among the various witnesses. Mrs. Yantis says that she doesn't believe that he moved his weapon toward the officers. Mr. Paradis indicates that he doesn't address that. I think I need some help here in terms of he doesn't say that there was he doesn't recognize any motion by the officers as by Mr. Yantis as aggressive.
Neither of Donnie Yantis or Rowdy Paradis witnessed Jack Yantis pointing the rifle towards the officers.
But the officers who were closer in proximity, but again, this is a very compact space. Officer Wood indicated that, that Mr. Yantis moved his gun in the direction across Officer Wood and toward Officer Rowland. Officer Rowland indicated that he saw this movement and he immediately removed his handgun in a defensive manner, and that and again, this is in dispute. Who fired first? Some indicate perhaps Mr. Yantis did, or it was simultaneous. But in any event, as Mr. Yantis moved, there was firing that occurred. And Mr. Yantis was struck 12 times?
Yes.
And ended up in the roadway on the southbound lane. In that exchange of gunfire, as it happened, Officer Rowland said, I'm hit, and Mrs. Yantis has at least in one statement saying she believes she heard Officer Rowland say, I'm hit. In this exchange of gunfire, Mr. Yantis, we know, had retrieved his weapon, worked the bolt, and there was in his gun a discharged round. Now, we do not know the location of that bullet. There is in this scene a .20 caliber bullet that is in the middle of this scene that we have no explanation as to why it ended up there. It was there. It was found. We have that was submitted to ballistics testing, and the experts who examined that said that it was a .20 caliber round, 20 caliber bullet, but could not confirm or would not confirm that it came from Mr. Yantis's gun. So, and he was shooting a .20 caliber round, but they cannot confirm that it came from his gun. So, within that very close time frame, I've tried to explain to you what happened. Out of all of this, recognize that with nearly every statement made by a witness, there is a contradictory statement. It's a very, very complex situation happening very rapidly, short time space, and close confines. Have I fairly described what's happened? Anything else you think I need to?
The only thing I would clarify about the position of the officers, there are statements that are made that Officer Rowland was actually the officer that had some interaction with Mr. Yantis, and that it wasn't actually Officer Wood. The other thing with their insistent about is that the officers are closer to Mr. Yantis than either Mrs. Yantis or Mr. Paradis.
So, given that scene and the other, what we do know is that the officers fired, and we also know that Mr. Yantis's rifle was fired. That's what we know. So with that, I have a couple more things I think we'd like to talk about, and then we'll talk about questions. There were two other witnesses that provided some insight. They were not primary witnesses. They were first responders who were further away from the events. One of them was able to confirm the statement by Mr. Yantis as he exited the four-wheeler. At least we know that such a statement was made. What the exact content of that statement was, we don't know. I don't know if I mentioned that when Officer Rowland indicated that he'd been hit, that Mrs. Yantis confirmed that he had said, I've been hit. His clothing was tested, and there was no bullet strike. There was no evidence of him being hit. Of course, everyone in the scene had gun residue because everyone was in close proximity when all these weapons were fired. Mr. Yantis had 12 bullet wounds to his chest, upper extremities, and abdomen. Mr. Yantis' rifle contained one spent shell casing, and so it indicates that his weapon was actually fired, and in some measure corroborates the statements by Deputies Wood and Rowland. Tests also showed that Mr. Yantis' blood alcohol content was 0.104, and that is consistent with statements by Mr. Paradis that Mr. Yantis had been drinking throughout the day and had some alcoholic beverage at dinner. What is the relevance of that? It's simply one of the facts. That's what the reports show. But after thoroughly reviewing all the materials, the facts, the lab tests, and witness statements, I have determined that the evidence in this case is insufficient to support a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt of Deputies Wood and Rowland. We recognize and acknowledge there's been criticism from the media, from the community, and others about the length of this process. And I guess we would all hope that government was able to work in a much faster way, but that isn't the way our system is built. I want to go back and kind of give you a little bit of a timeline to help you understand. First of all, this event occurred on November 1st, 2015. ISP responded immediately. Within a few days, we were appointed by we were appointed by a state district court judge to be special prosecutors in the case, and ISP undertook its investigation. We sporadically received information from them as the primary investigators, and at one point asked them to not send us this piecemeal, but to send us the matter in bulk when they received it. We received from ISP the last of their materials on March 10th. I think they issued a press release when they did that. However, the final pieces of evidence did not reach us. That included the ballistics testing, and it also, after we had done some initial review, we asked the Idaho State Police to go back and do a subsequent interview with Deputy Rowland, and that document was received. I can't remember which of those two came on the 7th or the 8th, but we received them, one on the 7th, one on the 8th. So by the 8th of June, we had received all the relevant material. If you recognize that we've then had this entire matter in our hands for less than 2 months, about 7.5 weeks is the time period with which we've had to consider all of this. The file contains 5,300 pages of documents, 830 photographs, 590 photographs, and more than 30 hours of audio, and of a mock-up of the scene, not a mock-up, but a reconstruction of the scene, and a run-through by the respective officers. In addition, on June 13th, my staff went to Meridian. The Idaho State Police had consented to do a second mock-up of this scene, a second reconstruction. Not mock-up, that's not the right term, reconstruction of this scene. And so that we were then able to go through the events from the various perspectives and the various testimonies. So we went and saw all of that. In addition, on that day, we traveled to council and went and stood in this scene, and quite frankly, dodging traffic, were able to take a look at all of the various vantage points as they occurred in the scene. And I'm telling you, this is a very tight location, very compacted, and the events here occurred in a very short time period. By any means, that's an extensive record to go through. And from day one, I asked my staff to be objective, to take their time, to move deliberately, because we only get one chance to do this right. They did that, and I'm grateful. And as a result of all of that, I asked them not to set any arbitrary deadlines, and they didn't. And considering all the facts, the evidence, the statements by the various witnesses, and the conflicting statements by those witnesses, I have concluded that there is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt of any criminal activity by Officers Wood and Rowland. This is a tragic event. This is catastrophic to a community. I wish there were a different outcome, but I don't have the ability to do that. But my duty, my obligation, my responsibility is to make certain that justice is done. And justice for Mr. Yantis is that if a crime was committed, that those who committed that crime be held responsible. There's justice for our community, and there's also justice for these officers. And what the law provides is that if I do not believe I have evidence to prove their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, I am ethically bound and justice required not to file criminal charges. That's what we have decided. So with that, certainly would try and address whatever questions you may have, and most willing to stand at the podium to make a formal statement for you that wish to have that.
This is fine. Yeah, I think this is fine, if you're okay with that.
I'm okay with that.
Because all the other shots kind of surround that.
If you're okay with it, then I don't see.
I didn't want to make it too formal. I was mostly, I will tell you, trying to help you understand what happened and what our responsibility is. So questions?
Well, what would you say is the most important piece? What's the most important physical evidence in this case?
There are a number of pieces of physical evidence. Among those that are important is the fact that Mr. Yantis' gun was fired. That is an indication that there was some risk to the officers, and whether that was reasonable or not, and the burden that we would then have to prove that their behavior was not reasonable. That's a challenge based upon those facts. That's not the only fact in this case, but that is one of those facts.
Would body cameras have made it easier to clarify exactly what happened for you?
Well, we don't know exactly what the body cameras would show, but I would surmise that body cameras would have been very helpful in this incident. It would have been able to remove some of the confusion among the various witnesses, but I'm not able to go back and reconstruct that. I have to find the scene the way it is, the evidence the way it is, and we don't have any body cam.
Is this some of the most confusing 5 minutes that you have ever dealt with from a legal perspective?
I'm not going to say that it's the most confusing, but I'm going to tell you this is a very confusing 5 minutes. And you consider the fact that the phone call went from dispatch to Mr. Yantis at 7:22. So, excuse me, that was the radio call to dispatch at 7:22. So it takes them a couple of moments to call Mr. Yantis. He's at dinner. He's going to have to take some moment, get his gun, get his things ready, and drive down to the scene. So you take that 5 minutes and you've now compressed it even more than just that 5 minutes. And so all of this unfolds in a very rapid fashion. Again, as I said, from his perspective, I'm at dinner table. I get this phone call. I go down, do nothing more than drive to the end of my driveway, and within minutes, I am dead. Something went tragically wrong, catastrophically wrong in this instance.
My last question is, you were talking about that the officers were concerned that the rifle was being pointed that way, that the firing was going to go that. Were there people hanging out down there? I mean,
Yes,
they were in line of fire?
There was an accident scene down
You know,
here.
on a training range, you always have to keep your weapon down.
There's an accident scene down here. Now, there is a dispute as to which direction he was firing. Mrs. Yantis and Mr. Curtis say, well, he was firing alongside this pickup. There's a ditch, a deep gully of some sort that then has a culvert that comes underneath the road. And their indication was that he was firing into the ditch. The officer's perception was that he was firing safe in south. And their concern was that he was firing in the direction of an accident scene where we have injured people, we have emergency personnel there, and we have traffic that has also been allowed to come through the scene. That was their concern.
From the collision with the bull.
From the collision with the bull.
When Yantis fired his gun, where did you guys find that bullet?
We cannot account for Mr. Yantis' bullet. Again, all we know is that there is a .20 caliber bullet in the middle of the road. That is not, we cannot account for that bullet. We don't know that that's from Mr. Yantis' gun. It is of the same caliber, but we cannot account for that round. With regard to the officers, you're going to have to help me out with the other rounds fired and what we can account for. We know that there were 20 rounds fired.
Correct.
That we can account for 18 of those rounds. We cannot account for 2 of those rounds. 12, there were 6 rounds in the bull, although the bull had 8 wounds. 6 of them we know were from bullets. One of them we believe was from, one wound was from hitting the car, the glass wound from the car. One of them was a wound when they did the necropsy on the bull. They released some of the body gases. And there were 12 wounds on Mr. Yantis, meaning that there were about 20 rounds fired. We can account for 18 of them.
20 rounds fired, including the shots at the bull?
At the bull, yes. Including the shots at the bull.
Yeah, in the whole melee,
In the
20
whole-
rounds were fired.
20 rounds plus
The 12.
the one from Mr. Yantis.
What were the
21.
discrepancies in witness accounts that made it, what were the significant ones that made it difficult to prove guilt?
The fact that nearly every aspect of this case, there is a person who will make a statement and there's a countervailing statement by another witness. Where the officers were, which officer it was who had an interaction with Mr. Yantis, whether Mr. Yantis moved his gun or didn't move his gun, when the shots were fired. Nearly every aspect of this case is in conflict among the 4 primary witnesses that were in close proximity at this scene. That is the complexity. That, coupled with the fact that Mr. Yantis' gun was in fact fired, is an indication that there was some measure of risk. But the answer is, this is a very complicated crime scene.
Was the bull dead when Mr. Yantis arrived?
No, the bull was not dead when Mr. Yantis arrived. And as I tried to say, he walked around the bull, pointing south. That's when the altercation took place. Ultimately, the bull got up and moved and then ended up in the scene facing in a southerly direction. Again, this is not a static scene. This is a very dynamic scene where things are changing momentarily.
And what is the evidence that you guys found that proves that Yantis did fire his gun? With the residue? Or what was that?
It's a round in the chamber that has been fired. When he arrived at the scene, he worked the action of his weapon. And when the gun was retrieved, there is a spent casing in the chamber.
Which he didn't have time to eject.
Correct?
He was shot.
Well, I wasn't there. I don't know.
Yeah, but the spent casing would have gone out if he'd worked
If
the
he had
action.
if he had worked the action, the shell would have been ejected. There was a spent shell casing in the chamber of Mr. Yantis' gun.
Which the other evidence on whether or not he fired his gun is that both officers claim that he fired his gun. And that the physical piece of evidence is consistent with their account that Mr. Yantis fired the gun.
And Officer Rowland said, I'm hit. That is sustained by Mrs. Yantis, who says, the Officer Rowland said, I'm hit. Now, the physical evidence doesn't indicate that he was hit, but that's the evidence that we have.
When did he say that in relation to when they fired those 12 shots?
According to the officer and verified by Mrs. Yantis, and you make sure I'm saying this correctly, it happened while this was going on, while the shots were being fired, correct?
I think it was very shortly after the shots were fired.
Okay.
You brought up over and over again the criminal standard of reasonable doubt. Do you have any doubt outside that criminal standard that the officers did things that could have been done better on that day?
A couple of things I'll respond to you. First of all, our function, our role, our responsibility is to answer the criminal question, whether there is proof beyond a reasonable doubt that a crime was committed here. And the answer to that question is no. Our focus isn't and should not have been what could have happened differently. What I've tried to express is that this went catastrophically wrong. This should not have happened. Other things should have been the outcome of this circumstance. This isn't how this is supposed to happen. So something did go wrong.
But you don't know what it was.
Well, our focus of our investigation is not to make the determination of all of the things that may have gone wrong. Our focus is only one thing, and that is there proof beyond a reasonable doubt? So the policy questions of what went wrong here, how can it be corrected, those are determined in other forums. That's not the focus of a criminal investigation, and it's not the decision that we made.
You know that there are a lot of people in that community who are not going to feel like justice will ever be served. So, what's the closure for them?
Recognizing that I've tried to express my concern for the community, that we have a very limited role. That very limited role is to make a determination of whether we have proof beyond a reasonable doubt. We do not. And justice demands that we not then file criminal charges. And it isn't to assuage, feelings of distress. This is a community that is in extreme distress. And I certainly hope that over time that there can be some healing and some feeling. And one of the things that we've heard most often is that some of these folks don't feel safe in their own homes. I certainly hope they have an opportunity as a community to come together and to resolve some of those issues. That's my great hope.
The timeline you gave us gave you the ability to finalize and make a decision?
What we were trying to do was get some clarification on some of the issues that we saw that arose. That probably gave us a little bit of clarification, but not a great deal. It meant that the stories we would expect from these 4 witnesses were basically what we were going to get, and there wasn't reason to do more. But I mean, it was very thorough. We have 5,300 pages of written reports. I certainly invite you to have an opportunity to read it.
General Wasden, you
Yeah.
said, I wish there would have been, or I wish there would have been.
I wish Mr. Yantis had not been shot. I mean, he's at dinner. He drives down to the end of his driveway, and 5 minutes later, less than that actually, he's shot dead. I mean, that's a tragic and terrible outcome. I wish there would have been some other outcome. The outcome should have been, he goes back to dinner. That's what the outcome should have been.
Should there be a legal requirement for body cam video for all officers in the state?
Again, that's beyond the scope of a criminal investigation. I certainly believe that as police agencies and as a state, that's a conversation that should take place, policy decision outside the scope of what we were trying to do. But I certainly think that it would have been very helpful in this instance had we had some body cam video. Right now, quite frankly, they now have glasses that take video, so that it's where the head is moving. I'm not here to talk about and debate the issue of body cam, but video evidence here would have been extremely helpful.
Are those 2 officers back on the job?
That's not a question for me to answer. That's a matter for the local agency. Again, our focus is one thing. Do we have proof beyond a reasonable doubt of criminal activity? And the answer is no.
The 20 caliber bullet that was found, was that not able to be matched to Mr. Yantis' gun because it was damaged, or basically what was the situation with that? The ballistics?
What I can tell you, the ballistics report said that it was a 20 caliber bullet, and that they could not match that to Mr. Yantis' gun. I'm relying on the experts. I'm relying on the experts. I didn't do the examination.
Is there any evidence that shows where the round that was fired from Mr. Yantis' gun went to, other than that round that was found on the road?
We are not able to otherwise account for that round, and I'm not saying that the round found in the scene was from Mr. Yantis' gun.
The other weapons that were there were different caliber, though.
Correct. Officer Wood had a .223 Remington rifle, and Officer Rowland had a .45 caliber pistol.
And the officers were wearing body cameras, but they weren't turned on, is that correct?
The officers did have body cameras. One of them, I think I tried to explain this, one of them was on standby and the memory was full. The other one explained, when asked by ISP why it was not turned on, said that this was a traffic accident, it wasn't a critical event, and therefore had not turned on his body cam. And so, I mean, that explains why it was not on. And from our perspective, the fact is, we simply don't have body cam video.
And were there cameras in their vehicles as well, or do you?
And some of the patrol vehicles, and some or all, I don't know which, had dash cam videos, but they were not on.
Anything else? All right.
Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. Appreciate your understanding and ability to get you in here around this table and explain it to you.
We appreciate it. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for coming.
I do have
Okay, so I'm going to end the live stream here, but we do have more information and links to some of those documents released on our website, 6onyourside.com, and we will have live reports through all of our newscasts this evening starting at 5 p.m.